Hello and welcome to Study with Sudhir. You are watching your digital classroom. My name is T.S. Sudhir, and as part of our book recommendation, before we get to explanation video number 2 of the Chinese statue, which is part of your ISC English literature syllabus both for class 11 and 12. This is a book, a thriller, as part of the shorts kind of category, which means that you can actually finish reading this thriller in just about 90 odd minutes. That's the time that I took to read this thriller. This is called A Brutal Hand. And it's written by Ravi Subramaniam, one of my favorite authors, along with Jigs Usher. This is the book cover. I don't know if you can see it on my Kindle. These days I'm reading it on my Kindle. I'm not ordering books, so doesn't cost much. But again, if you are someone who loves to write original stories, and even from an examination point of view, for ISC students, or if you're an ICSC student who wants to attempt writing an original story, it would be worth your while to actually invest in reading as much as possible, because it will kind of widen your horizons, right? And also help you write those kind of original stories. How should a plot structure be? How should the intro be? How should you conclude? How do you keep the interest of the reader, in your case the examiner, alive through those 450, 500 odd words? So this craft you can kind of get better at only if you read a lot. So as I always say, read, 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 right? Just like it was said in that poem, Television, right? So A Brutal Hand by Ravi Subramaniam, I recommend it. I quite liked it, yes, because it is written in a very swift manner. Some of the characters you may feel could have been fleshed out a little better. That was my only angst with it. But otherwise, I think a very fast moving thriller which definitely will interest you, and the twist when you find out who the murderer actually is would definitely surprise you. It definitely surprised me. Okay, now let's get to I'm putting the details in the description box. Okay, now we'll get to explanation video number 2 of the Chinese statue. You think the statue is good? Ask the craftsman through the interpreter. It is magnificent, the minister replied. Quite magnificent. My own work is not worthy to stand by its side, added the craftsman humbly. Now, we have seen that the craftsman, the Chinese craftsman, has shown this statue of Emperor Kung to Sir Alexander, who is completely taken in by it, and he says, you think the statue is good? Ask the craftsman through the interpreter. So he wants to know Sir Alexander's opinion. It's magnificent, the minister replied. Quite magnificent. My own work is not worthy to stand by its side, added the craftsman humbly. So he says, what I am making in my work area is not good enough to stand by its side, which is why I have not kept it in my work area. No, no, said the minister, though in truth the little craftsman knew the great man was only being kind, as most diplomats generally are. They're known to be diplomatic in the way they speak. For Sir Alexander was holding the ivory statue in a way that already showed the same love as the old man had for the piece, which means almost holding it like this. The minister smiled down at the craftsman as he handed back the Emperor Kung, and then he uttered perhaps the only undiplomatic words he had ever spoken in 35 years of serving the queen, his queen, and the country. Undiplomatic means because diplomats generally are known to weigh their words very carefully. When I say weigh their words, essentially means choose their words very carefully, are very careful about what they speak, how they speak, the tone in which they speak. Everything is very careful. Diplomats by training are built that way. So in fact, if it's always very difficult to get out details out of a diplomat, because they know how to actually get their way around using clever words. Okay, but here Sir Alexander, perhaps for the first time in his 35 years as a diplomat, through his different postings in Calcutta, Vienna, Rome, etc., first time he says something very undiplomatic, which means without applying his mind, without thinking much. How I wish the piece was mine. He wishes that the piece belonged to him. Sir Alexander regretted voicing his thoughts. Immediately he heard the Mandarin translate them. So there is a time, you see, he says it in English and then the Mandarin has to translate it into Chinese for the Chinese craftsman to understand. So the moment he did that, he regretted it. Array, I should not have said something like that. Because he knew too well, because he is very conversant, very familiar, very aware of the Chinese traditions. He knew too well the old Chinese tradition that if an honored guest, which Sir Alexander is, requests something, the giver will grow in the eyes of his fellow men, that is fellow Chinese, by parting with it. So if I go to a Chinese and I say that, wow, what a fantastic piece of work, the Chinese is kind of, as per Chinese tradition and culture, he will go out of his way to gift it to you so that people in his community actually look at him with a lot of awe and respect. So his own stature goes up in Chinese society as a result of being very generous with what a guest to his home has actually appreciated and liked. A sad look came over the face of the little old craftsman as he handed back the figurine to the minister. Right? So the craftsman is not too happy at the request which has been made, or not the request, or at least the wish, the desire that the minister, that the ambassador had expressed. No, I was only joking. So he's now trying to make amends because he realizes that he has said something which he should not have said. Said Sir Alexander, quickly trying to return the piece to the owner. You would dishonor my humble home if you did not take the emperor, your excellency, the old man said anxiously, and the Mandarin gravely nodded in his agreement. So the translator and the craftsman are both saying that you should be taking away this particular piece of Emperor Kung. The minister remained silent for some time. I have dishonored my own home, sir, he replied, and looked towards the Mandarin who remained inscrutable. So the minister remained silent and he says, I have dishonored my own home. That I should not have said, and as a result of my saying this, this is a dishonor to my own home, right? So inscrutable means impossible to read someone's mind. You know, the Mandarin, the translator, you cannot read out what is going on in his mind. Okay, he's very inscrutable, and this is an important aspect that Jeffrey Archer has pointed out. So the Mandarin nodding his agreement is important because it kind of conveyed the dilemma, that he understood the dilemma, that what the ambassador had said and how the craftsman will react. He understood the Chinese culture obviously, and he understood the dilemma. The minister dishonored by making this wish because by taking away something precious that has been there for 7 generations at that particular place, because he also knew the Chinese tradition, which is why he's saying, I have dishonored my own home, because he knew the Chinese tradition, but he did not think of it before making that kind of a wish publicly, openly, because he was an expert in Chinese matters. The little craftsman bowed. I must fix a base on the statue, he said, and you will not be able to put the piece on view. He went to a corner of the room and opened a wooden packing chest that must have housed 100 bases for his own statues. Rummaging around, rummaging means kind of searching around, you know, in a very hurried kind of manner. He picked out a base decorated with small dark figures that the minister did not care for, but which nevertheless made a perfect fit. The old man assured Sir Alexander that although he did not know the base's history, the piece bore the mark of a good craftsman, right? So he did not know who had made it, but he definitely was sure that it was made by an expert craftsman. The embarrassed minister took the gift and tried hopelessly to thank the little old man. The craftsman once again bowed low as Sir Alexander, and the expressionless, earlier the word used was inscrutable, now the word used is expressionless, meaning the same thing, Mandarin left the little workshop. So he's emphasizing on the fact that the Mandarin was not reacting. Make a note of that. As the party traveled back to Peking, the Mandarin observed the terrible state the minister was in and uncharacteristically spoke first. Your Excellency is no doubt aware, he said, of the old Chinese custom that when a stranger has been generous, you must return the kindness within the calendar year. That is, within the same year, calendar year, you must return, and basically, you know, there should not be any debt on you in that sense. If he has given you something, you must actually repay that debt of gratitude in some way or the other. Your Excellency, because ambassadors are referred to in that terms. Sir Alexander smiled his thanks and thought carefully about the Mandarin's words. Once back in his official residence, he went immediately to the embassy's extensive library to see if he could discover a realistic value for the little masterpiece. After much diligent research, diligent as in extensive and very careful research, he came across a drawing of a Ming statue that was almost an exact copy of the one now in his possession, and with the help of the Mandarin, he was able to assess its true worth, a figure that came to almost 3 years emolument for a servant of the crown. That is, salary of 3 years is what the worth of that particular piece of craftsmanship is. The minister discussed the problem with Lady Heathcote and she left her husband in no doubt as to the course of action he must take. So she agrees with what the Mandarin has told him, that he must do something in return to the Chinese craftsman, right? The following week, the minister dispatched a letter by private messenger to his bankers, Coutts and Company in the Strand, London, requesting that they send a large part of his savings to reach him in Peking as quickly as possible. So he's obviously having to withdraw money deposited in his bank in London. When the funds arrived 9 weeks later, 9 weeks as in more than 2 months, the minister again approached the Mandarin, who listened to his questions and gave him the details he had asked for 7 days later, right? So he got the details from the Mandarin and so he wants to execute what he wants to give back to the Chinese craftsman. The Mandarin had discovered that the little craftsman Yung Li came from the old and trusted family of Yung Shao, who had for some 500 years been craftsmen. Sir Alexander also learned that many of Yung Li's ancestors had examples of their work in the palaces of the Manchu princes. So he has done his extensive research. Okay, please mark out these main words, which basically the kind of questions that you get from this particular the Chinese statue lesson are ones which will kind of focus on detail, because there isn't much kind of meaning in many senses. It's not like a Salvatore kind of a story, right? It's not even a quality kind of a story where there is a lot of deep meaning in the story, right? Or the story of an hour. This particular story is very basic and very straight. So attention to detail is what you need to focus on when you are preparing this lesson with the examinations in mind. Yung Li himself was growing old and wished to retire to the hills above the village where his ancestors had always died. His son was ready to now you are being told about the craftsman story. His son was ready to take over the workshop from him and continue the family tradition. The minister thanked the Mandarin for his diligence and had only one more request of him. The Mandarin listened sympathetically to the ambassador from England and returned to the palace to seek advice. So we will know what that request has been. A few days later, the Empress granted Sir Alexander's request. Okay, we'll know in the next page what that request was. Almost a year to the day, the minister, accompanied by the Mandarin, set out again from Peking for the village of Haluchon. When Sir Alexander arrived, he immediately dismounted from his horse and entered the workshop that he remembered so well. The old man was seated at his bench, his flat hat slightly askew as in turned, a piece of uncarved ivory held lovingly between his fingers. He looked up from his work and shuffled towards the minister, not recognizing his guest immediately until he could almost touch the foreign giant. Okay. Then he bowed low. The minister spoke through the Mandarin. I have returned, sir, within the calendar year to repay my debt. Okay. There is no need, Your Excellency. My family is honored that the little statue lives in a great embassy, that's the embassy of UK, and may one day be admired by the people of your own land when Sir Alexander returns after 3 years and goes back to London. The minister could think of no words to form an adequate reply and simply requested that the old man should accompany him on a short journey. Okay, so that's the request he's making to the Chinese craftsman through the Mandarin who is translating it for him. The craftsman agreed without question and the three men set out on donkeys towards the northern part. They travelled for over 2 hours up a thin winding path into the hills behind the craftsman's workshop, and when they reached the village of Martin, they were met by another Mandarin who bowed low to the minister and requested Sir Alexander and the craftsman to continue their journey with him on foot. They walked in silence to the far side of the village and only stopped when they had reached a hollow in the hill from which there was a magnificent view of the valley all the way down to Harlechurch. Now this is basically showing Sir Geoffrey Archer's ability to write in such great visual detail, right? That's what these lines are essentially showing to you. I mean, they do take the story forward to an extent, but the manner in which he has described it is the forte of Geoffrey Archer. In the hollow stood a newly completed small white house of the most perfect proportions. 2 stone-lion dogs, tongues hanging over their lips, guarded the front entrance. The little old craftsman, who had not spoken since he had left his workshop, remained mystified by the purpose of the journey until the minister turned to him and offered a small inadequate gift and my feeble attempt to repay you in kind. So what he is doing is he has managed to construct a house for the craftsman to live in his old age once his son took over the job from him and retired to the hills. So this is his way of repaying the debt for the sculpture of Emperor Kung that the craftsman so graciously gifted to him. The craftsman fell to his knees and begged forgiveness of the Mandarin, as he knew it was forbidden for an artisan to accept gifts from a foreigner. In Chinese law, you can't accept gifts from a foreigner, and Sir Alexander comes from the UK. The Mandarin raised the frightened blue figure from the ground, explaining to his countrymen that the Empress herself had sanctioned the minister's request. That is the request that he had made to the Mandarin, that he would need the okay, the nod, the approval of the Empress in China, right, at that time ruled by an Empress, in order to be able to ensure that he was able to gift this to the Chinese craftsman, Mandarin craftsman, and he being able to accept it from a Britisher. A smile of joy came over the face of the craftsman, and he slowly walked up to the doorway of the beautiful little house, unable to resist running his hand over the carved lion dogs. The three travelers then spent over an hour admiring the little house before returning in silent mutual happiness back to the workshop in Harluchun. The two men thus parted, honor satisfied that they were able to repay the debt, and Sir Alexander wrote to his embassy that night content that his actions had met with the approval of the Mandarin as well as Lady Heathcote. Okay, so both of them in approval of what he had managed to do. The minister completed his tour of duty in Peking, that is after 3 years, and the Empress awarded him the Silver Star of China, and a grateful queen added the KCVO to his already long list of decorations. The KCVO is being knighted. He becomes, from Alexander Heathcote, he becomes Sir Alexander Heathcote. That's like almost like the Bharat Ratna in India. KCVO's full form is Knight Commander Royal Victorian Order, right? So that's the Victorian order that is presented to people who have done some exemplary work for the country. After a few weeks back at the Foreign Office clearing the China desk, Sir Alexander retired to his native Yorkshire. Yorkshire is a county in England. Sir Geoffrey Boycott hailed from Yorkshire. He played cricket for Yorkshire, the only English county whose inhabitants still hope to be born and die in the same place, not unlike the Chinese. So there is something in common with the Chinese craftsmen. Sir Alexander spent his final years in the home of his late father with his wife and the little Ming emperor. The statue occupied the center of the mantelpiece in the drawing room for all to see and admire. Being an exact man, like we have already known right in the beginning of the story, Sir Alexander wrote a long and detailed will as in that is to be executed after he is no more, in which he left precise instructions for the disposal of his estate, all his wealth, including what was to happen to the little statue after his death. He bequeathed the Emperor Kung to his first son, requesting that he do the same, that he should pass on to his eldest son, in order that the statue might always pass on to the first son or a daughter. If the direct male line faltered, it could possibly happen that some son in future generations may not have a son, so it should pass on to the eldest daughter. He also made a provision that the statue was never to be disposed of, because it was equivalent to 3 years of his salary at the time that he had bought it in 1871. Unless the family's honor, and this is important, unless the family's honor was at stake, that unless situation came to such a, it was such a situation that the honor of the family was at stake, was in question, only then the statue could be sold. Sir Alexander Heathcote died at the stroke of midnight on his 70th year. So at the age of 70, he passed away. We will pause here. In the next part, we will know about what his future generations did and how did the statue came to Sotheby's for the auction, and then what happened, what dramatic event took place during the auction. Okay, so stay tuned. We'll meet you in in part 3 of this particular story, the Chinese statue, the effect of teaching Shakespeare. Thank you very much for watching.